Police called it a murder-suicide within hours. 2 bodies, 1 home, 1 official conclusion. But almost immediately, that conclusion raised questions it could not answer. Christina Chambers was a public-facing professional, a familiar name, a woman with an active future, ongoing plans, and no public history suggesting a final act of violence. Yet by the end of first press briefing, her death had already been placed into a category that closes cases quickly and quietly. What happened inside that house before first responders arrived? Why were certain details released immediately while others were withheld? And how did investigators determine intent before the full timeline was publicly reconstructed? This case is not defined by what was said, but by what was decided early, a scene assessed fast, a narrative established faster, and a ruling that, once announced, reshaped how every remaining detail will be interpreted. Was the evidence truly definitive? Or did the label come before the analysis? In this documentary, we examine the hours, the statements, the physical findings, and the gaps that remain after the headlines moved on. Because when a case is ruled closed too soon, the most important questions often surface after the decision, not before it. This is the Christina Chambers case, and this is where certainty begins to fracture. Murder-suicide ruled. The deaths of Christina Chambers, age 38, and her husband, Johnny Rhymes Jr., age 41, were formally ruled a murder-suicide by authorities following a morning response to their residence on Highland Manor Court in Hoover. The ruling was communicated publicly within hours of the discovery and immediately established the investigative classification under which the case would be handled. According to official belief, as stated by law enforcement, Rhymes shot Chambers and then himself. Both individuals were pronounced dead on the scene at 9:12 a.m. Their 3-year-old son, Constantine, was located inside the home and was reported to be unharmed. No indication was given at the time that the child had witnessed the shootings, nor were further contextual details regarding his location within the residence publicly released. The designation of murder-suicide occurred before the release of any detailed forensic documentation. Authorities did not publicly reference autopsy findings, ballistic analysis, gunshot residue testing, or scene reconstruction when announcing the ruling. Instead, the conclusion was presented as a belief-based determination derived from preliminary assessment. Chief Deputy Coroner Bill Yates stated that the shootings occurred within a defined time window between approximately 6:15 a.m. and 9:03 a.m., providing the temporal bounds that would later frame all public discussion of the incident. No explanation was offered regarding how that window was narrowed or what evidentiary indicators were used to establish it. Christina Chambers had returned to the residence at approximately 6 a.m. or shortly thereafter following a morning run. This fact placed her presence in the home during the estimated period in which the shootings were believed to have occurred. Police were called to the 700 block of Highland Manor Court shortly after 9 a.m., following the discovery made by Rhymes' parents. The parents had gone to home after the family failed to arrive for a scheduled Christmas program at Prince of Peace Catholic School, where Chambers and her family were parishioners. This sequence of events established the external trigger for the emergency response, but did not provide insight into the internal circumstances preceding the deaths. Once announced, the murder-suicide ruling functioned as a closing classification rather than provisional finding. No public statement suggested that alternative manners of death were being considered, nor was there any indication that conclusion was subject to later revision pending additional analysis. The ruling shaped the scope of subsequent disclosures, limiting public understanding to outcome rather than process. Investigative steps that may have occurred after the initial determination were not described, and no future briefings were scheduled to elaborate on evidentiary support. The speed with which the case was ruled resolved distinguished it from investigations that remain open pending forensic confirmation. By the end of the same morning in which the bodies were discovered, the case had been publicly categorized and effectively concluded. From that point forward, all official references to the incident adhered to the established narrative. The ruling stood as a definitive explanation, not accompanied by detailed substantiation, and will remain the foundation upon which the case record was closed. The first police narrative. The first police narrative in the Christina Chambers case was established rapidly and communicated with a degree of certainty that left little room for subsequent modification. Shortly after officers responded to the residence on Highland Manor Court in Hoover, authorities publicly stated their belief that Johnny Rhymes Jr. had shot Christina Chambers and then himself. This account was presented as the operative explanation for the deaths and was not framed as preliminary or conditional. From its initial release, the narrative functioned as a settled conclusion rather than an evolving assessment based on staged investigative findings. The narrative relied primarily on temporal framing rather than detailed evidentiary description. Chief Deputy Coroner Bill Yates stated that the shootings occurred between approximately 6:15 a.m. and 9:03 a.m., establishing a defined interval that would anchor the case chronology. This time window was communicated without accompanying explanation regarding how it was calculated or which indicators were used to determine its boundaries. No references were made to physiological estimates, environmental factors, or witness-derived timing. The statement stood alone as an authoritative marker rather than an evidentiary synthesis. In outlining the sequence of events, police confirmed that Christina Chambers had returned to the home after a morning run at approximately 6 a.m. or shortly thereafter. The narrative placed her inside the residence during the estimated window of the shootings, but did not reconstruct her movements, interactions, or activities once inside. There was no public account of any communications, arguments, or other interactions preceding the deaths. The absence of such contextual detail meant that the narrative was defined by endpoints rather than by internal sequence. The discovery of the bodies by Rhymes' parents was incorporated into the narrative as the initiating factor for police response. Authorities stated that the parents went to the residence after the family failed to appear for a scheduled Christmas program at Prince of Peace Catholic School. This explanation accounted for how the incident came to official attention, but did not contribute to the explanation of how or why the shootings occurred. The narrative did not include any indication that neighbors, passers-by, or other third parties had reported disturbances or unusual activity during the relevant time frame. Notably, the initial police narrative did not include references to forensic analysis. No mention was made of weapon placement, ballistic trajectory, gunshot residue, or autopsy findings. The narrative also did not reference digital records, such as phone activity or messaging, that might contextualize the events of the morning. By omitting these elements, the account remained narrowly focused on the asserted sequence rather than the evidentiary basis supporting it. Once released, the first police narrative remained unchanged in all subsequent public references. There were no follow-up briefings that expanded upon its foundations or addressed potential uncertainties. The narrative's consistency derived from repetition rather than elaboration. As a result, it established an authoritative framework that shaped public understanding while leaving the underlying investigative process largely undisclosed. A timeline assembled quickly. The timeline presented in the Christina Chambers case was constructed from a limited number of fixed reference points and was communicated shortly after the deaths were discovered. Authorities did not describe the timeline as tentative or subject to revision, despite the absence of publicly disclosed forensic or digital corroboration at the time it was released. Instead, the sequence was framed as sufficient to support the ruling already announced. The structure of the timeline emphasized broad temporal boundaries rather than a detailed reconstruction of events inside the residence. According to official statements, Christina Chambers left her home early Tuesday morning for a routine run. She was known to be an avid runner, and authorities stated that she returned to residence at approximately 6 a.m. or shortly thereafter. This return time became the starting point for the interval during which the shootings were believed to have occurred. No public explanation was provided regarding how her return time was verified, nor was it specified whether this estimate was based on personal devices, third-party observation, or routine behavior patterns. Chief Deputy Coroner Bill Yates stated that the shootings occurred between approximately 6:15 a.m. and 9:03 a.m. This window spanned nearly 3 hours and functioned as the core temporal framework for case. The timeline did not identify specific moments within that interval, such as the order of the shootings or the elapsed time between them. No information was released regarding physiological indicators, lividity assessment, or environmental observations that might have narrowed the estimate. The window was presented as definitive without accompanying methodological explanation. The next confirmed point in the timeline occurred shortly after 9 a.m., when police were called to the 700 block of Highland Manor Court. The call followed the arrival of Johnny Rhymes Jr.'s parents at the residence after the family failed to attend a scheduled Christmas program at Prince of Peace Catholic School. This absence prompted concern and led to the discovery of the bodies. Authorities stated that both Chambers and Rhymes were pronounced dead at 9:12 a.m., marking the official end of the timeline as publicly described. The timeline did not include any internal markers between Chambers' return from a run and the arrival of Rhymes' parents. There was no reference to phone calls, messages, alarms, or other indicators that might suggest activity during the interval. The presence of the couple's 3-year-old son, Constantine, was noted only in outcome terms, with authorities stating that he was found unharmed inside the home. No details were released regarding where he was located or how long he had been unattended. By relying on a small number of anchor points, the timeline functioned as a skeletal framework rather than a comprehensive narrative. It established when the incident could have occurred but did not explain how the events unfolded within that period. The speed with which this timeline was assembled and presented aligned with the rapid ruling of the case, reinforcing a sense of chronological closure without revealing the evidentiary steps used to reach it. Inside the home, public information regarding the interior of the Highland Manor Court residence was limited from the outset of the investigation and remained so following the formal ruling of murder-suicide. Authorities confirmed that Christina Chambers and Johnny Rhymes Jr. were found inside the home, but did not provide a detailed description of the physical environment in which the deaths occurred. No room-by-room account was released, and there was no public discussion of where within the residence each individual was located at the time of discovery. The absence of such detail constrained any external understanding of the scene beyond the final outcome. Law enforcement statements did not reference the condition of the home upon entry. There was no mention of signs of forced entry, disturbance, or disarray, nor was there any indication of whether the scene appeared staged, static, or interrupted. Authorities did not describe lighting conditions, door or window positions, or the presence of any environmental factors that might have contextualized the events of the morning. The interior space was treated as a closed, evidentiary environment, with no descriptive narrative released to the public. The presence of the couple's 3-year-old son, Constantine, was confirmed, with officials stating that he was found unharmed inside the residence. However, no further details were provided regarding his location within the home or the circumstances under which he was discovered. There was no indication of whether he was asleep, secure in a room, or otherwise separated from the immediate area of the shootings. Authorities did not comment on whether child welfare protocols were initiated at the scene or what observations, if any, were made regarding his exposure to the incident. No information was released regarding the initial entry into the home by Rhymes' parents or responding officers. The narrative did not specify which doors were used, whether entry was forced, or how long the parents were inside the residence before contacting authorities. Similarly, there was no description of how first responders moved to the home or what sequence of observations led to confirmation of the deaths. These omissions left the discovery process undefined. The interior of the home also remained absent from any discussion of physical evidence. Authorities did not reference the location of any weapon within the residence, the proximity of objects to the bodies, or the presence of bloodstain patterns or other indicators commonly cited in scene analysis. No photographs, diagrams, or summaries were released to illustrate the spatial relationships within the home. The lack of such information meant that the interior environment could not be evaluated as part of the evidentiary record presented to the public. By withholding descriptive detail about the home's interior, officials limited the narrative to conclusions rather than observations. The residence itself, while central to the incident, remained largely uncharacterized in public reporting. This approach aligned with the rapid classification of the case and the absence of subsequent investigative briefings. As a result, the interior scene was preserved as an undisclosed element of the case, known only through its final determination rather than through transparent documentation. Injuries used to conclude. The determination that the deaths of Christina Chambers and Johnny Rhymes Jr. constituted a murder-suicide relied, according to public statements, on the nature of the injuries observed at the scene. Authorities stated their belief that Rhymes shot Chambers and then himself, but did not release any detailed medical or forensic description to explain how the injuries supported that conclusion. No autopsy report summaries were provided, and no medical examiner findings were quoted in public-facing statements beyond the acknowledgement that both individuals were pronounced dead on the scene at 9:12 a.m. There was no public discussion of the number of gunshot wounds sustained by either individual, their anatomical locations, or the sequence in which the injuries were believed to have occurred. Authorities did not describe wound trajectories, entry or exit characteristics, or proximity indicators that might have been used to distinguish between homicide and self-inflicted injury. The absence of such detail meant that the injuries themselves were cited as determinative without explanation of the analytical process used to interpret them. No reference was made to gunshot residue testing on either Chambers or Rhymes. Authorities did not state whether residue was present, absent, or inconclusive, nor did they describe whether testing had been completed at the time the ruling was announced. There was also no mention of stippling, soot deposition, or other close-range indicators that are often used to assess firing distance. Without these disclosures, the role of injury pattern analysis in reaching the conclusion remained opaque. Similarly, there was no public acknowledgement of defensive injuries or the lack thereof. Authorities did not state whether Chambers exhibited injuries consistent with defensive movement or restraint, nor did they indicate whether Rhymes showed any injuries beyond those attributed to a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The absence of commentary on these factors left unanswered how the injuries were evaluated in relation to intent, opportunity, and sequence. The injuries were presented as conclusive despite no public forensic description being released. Authorities also did not discuss physiological indicators used to estimate time of death. There was no mention of lividity, rigor mortis, or other post-mortem changes that might have informed the stated time window between 6:15 a.m. and 9:03 a.m. Chief Deputy Coroner Bill Yates provided the window without attributing it to specific medical observations, leaving the methodology undisclosed. Without autopsy findings or injury analysis made public, the medical basis for the ruling remained unexamined outside official channels. No limitations or uncertainties were acknowledged in relation to the injury assessment. Authorities did not state that findings were preliminary, nor did they indicate that additional testing could alter the interpretation. The ruling was communicated as final, suggesting that the observed injuries were deemed sufficient to meet the evidentiary threshold required for classification without further qualification. The conclusion relied on injuries that were never described, measured, or contextualized in public view. In cases involving firearm deaths, injury interpretation often intersects with weapon placement, ballistic evidence, and scene reconstruction. In this instance, however, the injuries were isolated from those supporting elements in official communication. The injuries were cited as outcome rather than evidence, functioning as a justification rather than an object of analysis. By treating the injuries as self-explanatory, the investigation closed without explaining what precisely they showed. The absence of disclosed injury analysis meant that the ruling rested on authority rather than transparent forensic reasoning. While officials stated their belief with confidence, the lack of detail prevented independent assessment of whether the injuries uniquely supported a murder-suicide determination or whether alternative interpretations could have been considered under different investigative standards. Weapon evidence framed. Public statements concerning weapon evidence in the Christina Chambers case were notably limited and remained so following the announcement of the murder-suicide ruling. Authorities did not provide a description of the firearm alleged to have been used, nor did they release information regarding its type, caliber, ownership, or registration status. The existence of the weapon was implied through the stated belief that Johnny Rhymes Jr. shot Christina Chambers, and then himself, but the evidentiary role of that weapon was not articulated in detail. As a result, the firearm functioned as an assumed component of the narrative rather than a documented element supported by disclosed analysis. Law enforcement did not publicly state where the weapon was found within the residence. There was no indication of whether it was recovered near either body, secured elsewhere in the home, or handled prior to the arrival of officers. The absence of location detail prevented assessment of spatial relationships that often inform conclusions about sequence and intent. No photographs, diagrams, or descriptive summaries were released to illustrate how the weapon's placement aligned with the official account. There was also no public discussion of ballistic testing. Authorities did not reference shell casings, bullet fragments, or projectile recovery, nor did they indicate whether any recovered items were submitted for laboratory examination. No statements were made regarding whether ballistic evidence was consistent with the injuries observed or whether test firing was conducted to confirm weapon function. The narrative did not include mention of matching projectiles to a specific firearm, leaving the technical basis for linking the weapon to the injuries undisclosed. Gunshot residue analysis was not addressed in public communication. Officials did not state whether residue testing was performed on either Christina Chambers or Johnny Rhymes Jr., nor did they indicate whether results were positive, negative, or inconclusive. Without such information, it was not possible to evaluate how residue findings, if any, factored into the determination of who fired the weapon or in what sequence. The absence of this discussion further limited transparency regarding the evidentiary process. The weapon central to the ruling was never publicly described, examined, or contextualized. Authorities also did not comment on weapon handling indicators, such as fingerprints, DNA, or trace evidence. There was no reference to whether the firearm was processed for biological material or whether any recovered samples yielded partial markers, degraded profiles, or inconclusive results. No caveats regarding contamination risk or inability to establish a unique match were discussed, leaving the impression that such analyses were either not conducted or not deemed necessary to disclose. Without forensic disclosure, the weapon's evidentiary value remained assumed rather than demonstrated. The framing of weapon evidence aligned with the rapid closure of the case. Once the murder-suicide determination was announced, the firearm was treated as corroborated by default rather than as a subject requiring detailed explanation. The narrative did not suggest that weapon analysis played an independent role in shaping conclusion. Instead, it appeared to follow the ruling rather than inform it. A critical piece of physical evidence existed primarily as an implication rather than a documented finding. In investigative contexts, weapon evidence often serves as a cornerstone for reconstructing events. In this case, however, the lack of publicly released information meant that the firearm's role was framed narrowly and conclusively, without examination of its characteristics or the analytical steps used to interpret it. By leaving the weapon unexplained, the case advanced toward closure without revealing how its presence supported the final determination. The result was a narrative in which weapon evidence reinforced an already established conclusion, rather than one in which the evidence itself was transparently evaluated and presented. This approach limited external scrutiny and ensured that the firearm remained an undisclosed but decisive factor within the official record. What evidence was not shown? The public record in the Christina Chambers case was notable not only for what was stated, but for what was omitted. Following the announcement of the murder-suicide ruling, authorities did not release supporting documentation that would typically accompany a definitive classification of this nature. No forensic reports, laboratory summaries, or evidentiary inventories were made available. The absence of such material shaped the public understanding of the case as one resolved by conclusion rather than by disclosed proof. There was no release of autopsy documentation or medical examiner summaries detailing cause and manner of death beyond the ruling itself. Authorities did not publish findings related to wound characteristics, toxicology screening, or post-mortem indicators. Without these disclosures, it was not possible to assess whether conclusions were based on comprehensive medical analysis or preliminary observation. Any limitations, uncertainties, or inconclusive findings were not acknowledged in public statements. Similarly, no crime scene documentation was released. Law enforcement did not provide photographs, diagrams, or narrative descriptions outlining the physical layout of the scene or the positioning of evidence. The absence of scene documentation prevented evaluation of spatial relationships that often inform investigative conclusions, such as distances, angles, or potential movement within the residence. The scene remained defined solely by outcome rather than by observable detail. Key evidentiary materials were never shown, yet the case was declared resolved. Digital evidence was also notably absent from public discussion. Authorities did not reference phone records, messaging activity, location data, or device usage from the morning of the incident. There was no indication that digital timelines were constructed or reviewed, nor were any findings summarized. In cases where chronology is central, the lack of disclosed digital analysis represented a significant omission. Without digital records or forensic reports, the evidentiary foundation remained unseen. Biological and trace evidence were similarly unaddressed. Authorities did not state whether DNA testing was conducted on a weapon, clothing, or surrounding surfaces. There was no mention of partial DNA markers, degraded samples, or contamination risk, nor was there any acknowledgement that a unique match could or could not be established. The absence of such information suggested either that testing results were not finalized at the time of the ruling, or that their disclosure was deemed unnecessary. The lack of disclosed evidence raised questions about what analyses were performed and which were bypassed. In addition, there was no public discussion of witness statements beyond the discovery by Rhymes' parents. Neighbors, first responders, or other potential sources of contextual information were not referenced. No statements were released indicating whether sounds, movements, or unusual activity had been reported during the estimated time window. The investigatory scope, as presented publicly, remained narrow. The evidentiary record, as shared, consisted primarily of conclusions rather than the materials used to reach them. By withholding or omitting detailed evidence, the case narrative relied heavily on institutional authority. The absence of disclosed forensic, digital, and physical findings limited the ability to evaluate whether the ruling was supported by comprehensive analysis or by selective interpretation. While official statements asserted certainty, the lack of transparency meant that certainty was not accompanied by demonstration. What evidence existed remained confined to investigative files, leaving the public record defined as much by omission as by declaration. Digital records left vague. Digital records, which often play a central role in reconstructing timelines and clarifying intent, were notably absent from public discussion in the Christina Chambers case. Following the announcement of the murder-suicide ruling, authorities did not reference any analysis of electronic data belonging to Christina Chambers or Johnny Rhymes Jr. No information was released regarding mobile phones, smart devices, computers, or wearable technology that might have been in use during the morning hours in question. The digital dimension of the case remained undefined, despite its potential relevance to establishing sequence and context. Christina Chambers was known to have gone for a run on the morning of the incident, returning home at approximately 6 a.m. or shortly thereafter. Public statements did not clarify whether this return time was verified through digital means, such as fitness tracking applications, GPS data, or timestamps from wearable devices. Authorities did not state whether such records were examined or whether they were relied upon to confirm her movements. The absence of this information left the source of the timeline estimate unclear. There was no public discussion of phone activity within the household during the estimated window between 6:15 a.m. and 9:03 a.m. Authorities did not indicate whether calls were placed, messages were sent or received, or alarms were triggered during that period. No mention was made of deleted communications, unsent drafts, or device inactivity that might have been relevant to the sequence of events. The narrative did not address whether devices were powered on, silenced, or otherwise altered. No digital timeline was presented, even as the case was declared resolved. Similarly, there was no reference to location data derived from cellular networks or applications. Authorities did not state whether location services were active on any devices, or whether movement within or outside the home could be inferred from digital records. In cases involving narrow time windows, such data often serves as corroboration, yet in this instance it was neither cited nor summarized. The absence of disclosed digital analysis left the chronology dependent on estimation rather than verification. Home-based digital systems were also not addressed. There was no mention of security cameras, smart doorbells, or other monitoring devices that might have been present in or around the residence. Authorities did not state whether such systems existed, whether they were reviewed, or whether they yielded usable information. The possibility of digital observation within the home was left unexplored in public statements. Digital silence surrounded a case defined by a precise but unexplained time window. By not disclosing whether digital records were examined, authorities limited the narrative to physical discovery and belief-based conclusions. The lack of digital context meant that intent, sequence, and opportunity were not publicly grounded in data that could independently support or challenge the ruling. The case advanced to closure without revealing whether electronic evidence was absent, inconclusive, or simply undisclosed. As a result, digital records existed in the case only as a potential, not as an evidentiary pillar. Whether such records were reviewed internally remained unknown, but their omission from public reporting ensured that the official narrative did not depend on them. The investigative file, as presented, relied on authority rather than demonstrable digital corroboration, leaving a significant dimension of the modern evidentiary landscape unexplored in the public record. No alternative suspect considered. From the moment the murder-suicide ruling was announced, the investigative scope of the Christina Chambers case was defined narrowly and exclusively. Public statements from authorities reflected a single explanatory framework in which Johnny Rhymes Jr. was identified as the sole actor responsible for both deaths. No indication was given that alternative suspects, scenarios, or manners of death were examined or remained under consideration at any stage following the discovery. The ruling itself appeared to foreclose competing explanations rather than emerge from a process in which they were tested and eliminated. Authorities did not state that investigators evaluated the possibility of third-party involvement. There was no reference to canvassing neighbors, reviewing reports of unusual activity in the area, or assessing whether any external individual had access to the residence during the relevant time window. The public narrative did not include mention of background checks, prior threats, or contextual factors that might typically be addressed before excluding other suspects. Instead, the determination that Rhymes acted alone was presented as self-evident. No alternate suspect was publicly named, evaluated, or ruled out before the case was declared resolved. The absence of alternative consideration was also evident in the lack of discussion regarding motive beyond the assertion implicit in the ruling. Authorities did not describe marital conflict, financial stress, or other precipitating factors, nor did they state that such factors were absent. The narrative did not suggest that investigators sought corroboration through interviews with friends, family members, or colleagues regarding recent behavior or statements. Without this context, the ruling functioned independently of motive analysis. By presenting a single explanation without documented comparison, the investigation limited its visible scope. There was likewise no acknowledgement of hypotheses that might challenge the official conclusion. Authorities did not state that other theories were examined and dismissed due to lack of evidence. The absence of such language suggested that alternative interpretations were not publicly entertained. In investigative reporting, the exclusion of alternatives is often as significant as their evaluation. In this case, exclusion was implied rather than demonstrated. The record showed resolution without a documented process of elimination. The narrow framing extended to the classification of evidence. Physical findings, injuries, and the presence of a weapon were interpreted within the murder-suicide framework from the outset, without indication that those elements were analyzed against competing scenarios. The investigative posture appeared confirmatory rather than exploratory, aligning evidence with the ruling rather than testing the ruling against evidence. Once the ruling was applied, the investigative lens did not widen again. The absence of publicly stated alternative suspect consideration reinforced the finality of the case. Without documentation that other possibilities were examined and excluded, the conclusion rested on assertion rather than comparative analysis. This approach ensured administrative closure, but limited transparency regarding the reasoning process. The case, as presented, moved directly from discovery to resolution without a visible phase of hypothesis testing. In doing so, it established a narrative that remained internally consistent but externally unexamined, leaving the public record defined by what was accepted rather than by what was considered and rejected. Speed of case closure. The speed with which the Christina Chambers case was classified and effectively closed distinguished it from investigations that proceed through extended evidentiary review. Within hours of the discovery of the bodies inside the Highland Manor Court residence, authorities announced their belief that the deaths resulted from a murder-suicide. This determination was communicated publicly on the same day, establishing a final investigative posture before detailed forensic findings or digital analyses were released. The rapid progression from discovery to conclusion defined the handling of case. Police were called to the residence shortly after 9 a.m., following the discovery by Johnny Rhymes Jr.'s parents. Both Christina Chambers and Rhymes were pronounced dead on the scene at 9:12 a.m. By the end of the morning, the manner of death had already been stated. The timeline provided by Chief Deputy Coroner Bill Yates, placing the shootings between approximately 6:15 a.m. and 9:03 a.m., was incorporated immediately into the narrative, despite the lack of disclosed methodology explaining how that interval was established. The case reached official closure on the same morning it was discovered. The speed of closure was reflected in the absence of follow-up investigative updates. Authorities did not announce that the ruling was preliminary or subject to change pending laboratory results. There was no indication that additional evidence was being sought or that further analysis could alter the conclusion. Instead, the ruling functioned as a terminal classification rather than an interim assessment. Once a conclusion was announced, the investigative process appeared to stop rather than continue. In many investigations, rapid determinations are later supplemented by detailed reports, clarifications, or revisions as evidence is processed. In this instance, no such supplementation occurred publicly. The initial narrative remained unchanged, and no subsequent briefings were held to elaborate on the evidentiary basis for the ruling. The absence of iterative disclosure reinforced the perception that the case had moved directly from response to resolution. The accelerated timeline left little opportunity for publicly documented verification. The speed also influenced the scope of public scrutiny. With the ruling established quickly, attention shifted toward remembrance and community response rather than investigative examination. Statements from employers, colleagues, and institutions focused on Christina Chambers' professional legacy and personal character, while official silence regarding investigative detail persisted. The pace of closure effectively narrowed the window during which questions might have been raised. The investigation concluded before its methods were explained. By prioritizing rapid classification, authorities ensured administrative finality but limited transparency. The case did not enter a prolonged investigative phase in the public record. Instead, it was resolved within a single news cycle. This approach reduced uncertainty in official terms but left unresolved how comprehensively evidence had been reviewed before closure. The speed of the case's conclusion became one of its defining characteristics, shaping both the narrative and the absence of further inquiry. Public reaction shifts. Following the announcement of the murder-suicide ruling, public reaction to the deaths of Christina Chambers and Johnny Rhymes Jr. shifted rapidly from initial shock to collective mourning. Media coverage and public discourse focused primarily on Chambers' professional career, community presence, and personal relationships rather than on the investigative aspect of the case. Statements released by colleagues, institutions, and acquaintances emphasized loss, remembrance, and character, reinforcing the finality of the official determination rather than questioning it. Tributes from members of the broadcast and athletic communities dominated public commentary. Former colleagues described Chambers as a dedicated professional whose presence elevated the work environment she occupied. These statements highlighted her career trajectory, including her years as a sports reporter and anchor, her role as a sideline reporter for major athletic events, and her later work as a broadcast journalism teacher. Public expressions of grief underscored her contributions and influence, framing the incident primarily as a personal and communal tragedy. Public attention moved quickly away from investigation and toward remembrance. Statements from employers and affiliated organizations further shaped the public narrative. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Alabama released a formal expression of condolence, describing Chambers as a cherished colleague whose warmth and personality impacted those around her. Educational institutions similarly emphasized her mentorship and professional achievements. These responses reinforced a tone of closure and respect, leaving little space for discussion of unresolved investigative elements. As tributes multiplied, investigative detail receded from public view. Social media responses mirrored this shift. Posts from journalists, athletic officials, and community members conveyed grief and solidarity, often recounting shared experiences and professional admiration. The volume and consistency of these messages created a collective focus on loss rather than inquiry. While such responses reflected genuine mourning, they also contributed to the absence of sustained public discussion about the circumstances of the deaths. The emotional weight of the tributes overshadowed questions about how conclusions were reached. Notably, public reaction did not include visible calls for further investigation or clarification from authorities. The ruling was widely accepted as stated, and no prominent public figures challenged its basis. The narrative surrounding the case stabilized quickly, shaped by expressions of sympathy rather than by demands for transparency. This acceptance further diminished the likelihood of renewed scrutiny. Once public focus settled on remembrance, the investigative narrative effectively closed. The shift in public reaction played a role in cementing the case's final status. With attention directed toward honoring Chambers' life and supporting those affected, the momentum necessary to question or revisit the ruling dissipated. The case entered the public memory as a resolved tragedy rather than an open inquiry. In this environment, the official explanation endured not because it was elaborated upon, but because it was no longer actively examined. Official silence follows. After the initial announcement of the murder-suicide ruling, official communication regarding the Christina Chambers case diminished rapidly and then ceased altogether. Authorities did not provide additional briefings, clarifications, or written reports expanding on the evidentiary basis for the conclusion. The absence of follow-up statements marked a clear transition from public engagement to institutional silence, reinforcing the finality of the ruling without further explanation. Law enforcement agencies did not release supplemental documentation, such as investigative summaries, incident reports, or redacted case files. No timelines were revised or elaborated upon, and no forensic findings were publicly summarized after the initial statements. The coroner's office did not issue additional commentary clarifying how the estimated time window between 6:15 a.m. and 9:03 a.m. had been established. In the absence of such information, the original narrative remained the sole official account. Once the ruling was issued, official communication effectively ended. Authorities did not address questions regarding whether additional investigative steps were undertaken after classification was announced. There was no indication that laboratory analyses, digital record reviews, or extended interviews were pending or completed. Officials did not state that further results would be forthcoming, nor did they suggest that the ruling might be revisited in light of new information. The silence implied closure rather than ongoing evaluation. The absence of continued communication left the investigative process largely unseen. Requests for clarification or additional detail, if made, were not answered through public channels. There were no press conferences or written updates to contextualize the decision-making process. This lack of engagement contrasted with cases in which authorities provide periodic updates to maintain transparency, even after conclusion has been reached. The decision to remain silent raised questions about what remained undisclosed. By refraining from further comment, officials limited the ability of external observers to assess the thoroughness of the investigation. Silence functioned as a reinforcing mechanism for the ruling, signaling that no reconsideration was anticipated. The absence of dialogue ensured that the case would not evolve publicly beyond its initial framing. In the absence of explanation, silence became the final statement. The official silence that followed the ruling effectively sealed the case in the public record. Without additional disclosures, the narrative remained static, defined by its earliest assertions rather than by comprehensive evidentiary review. This approach minimized public uncertainty, but also curtailed transparency. The case did not progress through stages of clarification or corroboration. Instead, it transitioned directly from announcement to archival status. As a result, the official record closed quietly, leaving unresolved questions unaddressed and ensuring that the ruling would stand without further elaboration. Ruled, not reopened. Following the issuance of the murder-suicide ruling, there was no public indication that the Christina Chambers case was subject to further review or reconsideration. Authorities did not announce any internal audits, secondary evaluations, or procedural reassessments that might suggest the conclusion was provisional. Instead, the ruling remained in place without qualification, signaling that the case had reached administrative finality. No statements were released indicating that new information was being sought or that existing findings were being re-examined. Law enforcement agencies did not reference any mechanisms for reopening the investigation. There was no mention of case review boards, independent oversight, or referral to external agencies for confirmation. The absence of such references reinforced perception that the ruling was not only accepted but institutionalized. In this context, the case was treated as closed, with no pathway publicly identified for renewed inquiry. Once ruled, the case did not re-enter investigative review. Officials also did not indicate that the ruling was contingent upon pending results. There was no suggestion that autopsy reports, laboratory analyses, or digital reviews could alter the conclusion. By presenting the determination as final from the outset, authorities remove the expectation of future updates. The ruling functioned as a terminal designation rather than a step within a longer investigative process. The absence of review signaled permanence rather than caution. Public records did not reflect any reconsideration prompted by external factors. Media coverage did not report challenges to the ruling from officials or institutions, and no supplemental statements were issued to address potential uncertainties. The lack of discourse around reevaluation suggested that the investigative process was deemed complete upon classification. The case remained fixed, not because new evidence confirmed it, but because no review was initiated. In many investigations, rulings are revisited when additional information emerges or when procedural questions arise. In this instance, however, no such process was acknowledged publicly. The absence of a reopening mechanism underscored the finality of the administrative decision and limited transparency regarding the criteria used to close the case. Finality was established through inaction rather than reaffirmation. By not reopening or revisiting the case, authorities ensured that the initial narrative would endure unchallenged. The ruling remained intact not through iterative validation, but through the absence of further inquiry. This approach reduced the likelihood of contradiction or revision, preserving institutional certainty while leaving evidentiary questions unresolved in the public record. As time passed without reassessment, the case transitioned from recent event to settled file, ruled and archived without reopening, and positioned to remain so indefinitely. On paper, the Christina Chambers case reached resolution within the same day it entered the public record. The murder-suicide ruling issued by authorities remained unchanged and unexpanded, serving as a final administrative classification of the deaths. No supplemental findings, forensic summaries, or investigative clarifications were released to contextualize the decision beyond its initial announcement. The case moved directly from discovery to closure, without a publicly documented phase of evidentiary corroboration. The official record reflects certainty, but that certainty is procedural rather than demonstrative. While the ruling established responsibility in sequence, it did so without disclosing the analytical steps used to arrive at those conclusions. In the absence of released forensic detail, digital analysis, or reconstructed chronology, the determination rests on institutional authority rather than transparent evaluation. Probability suggests acceptance rather than verification. Without physical evidence presented for public review, the ruling remains final in documentation but incomplete in exposition. As a result, the case is closed in official terms yet unresolved in substantive detail. Absent reopening or further disclosure, the Christina Chambers case is likely to remain settled on paper, while questions regarding process, evidence, and verification persist without formal answer.